everybody, this is Patrick with buildtolearn.io, and this is the first in a short series that will go over how to communicate data between Vue components. This is a subject that trips a lot of people up, and I think it's because there are so many options on how to get this done. Now, this first video will cover how to do this between parent and child components. Next, I'll cover how to do this between sibling components, that are two components that are alive on the page at the same time and share a parent. And finally, we go over how to do this between two components that aren't siblings, they're not related, and they're not even on the page at the same time, which is probably the more tricky situation. Now, if you haven't done so yet, hit that subscribe button, and that way you won't miss any of the updates coming up. Once you've done that, go to the codepen, fork it, and play along, because that's really the best way to learn. Let's get started. Okay, now before we begin, let's just quickly go over the codepen so I can highlight a few things to make sure you know what we're looking at. If you go down to the very bottom to start, you'll see that I've wired up Vue router. I want to make it clear, Vue router is not needed for any of this. I only set it up so I can easily jump between a few examples that I've put in the codepen. You do not need to use Vue router to communicate between components at all. So don't worry about that. If you don't know Vue router, you're not familiar with it, that is not a prerequisite. Okay, moving up a little bit more, you'll see that I have various constants defined. These are just a few sets of examples. We'll start at the top and we'll work our way down as we get more complicated with passing data around. And just above that, I have a users list object. This is just some dummy data. I didn't want to complicate things by making calls out to a third-party API or something. The emphasis here is on how to send data between components, and I don't want you getting sidetracked with chaining promises and the like. So fork this pen, and let's move on with parent and child communication. Now, the most simple example of how to send data from a parent down to a child is right in the documentation. And if you don't have the habit of reading through documentation yet, I highly recommend you develop that habit. Vue docs in particular are really good and really clear. So get used to it. They'll help you and they'll answer a lot of questions before you even get started. So let's hop over to the Vue docs. Under the components heading, we have a props subheading, and just below that we have passing data with props, and we'll take a look at the most basic example of sending data down to a child. So we have a child component defined right here. How you define that component doesn't really matter. If you're starting with the CLI projects, for example, you won't be defining a component like this. You'll have an actual Vue file, a .vue file, and so either way you use is just fine. The important thing is this middle part right here, how you're defining your options object. So that's what I want to highlight. In the parent component, this is how you add a child component. You use it much like you would any other HTML tag. So now that you've seen that, let's jump over to codepen and we'll get into a little more detail. So let's open up our parent and our child examples. This is the first route. You can see it over on the right-hand side. On the left, I have parent, and on the right, I have child. Now, my child component is just a simple template, doesn't do anything else right now. Down in the parent, we have a parent template. So this is what is wrapping around the child. The child will be inside this template. And how we wire the two up is by using the components property. So on components, it's an object. I set a property and I just call it child component. And with that, I reference child, which is defined just above. All right. Now to add that to the template, I take my property name right here and I add it in just like I would any other HTML tag. I add it right there into the template. So that's how I get that. If I remove this and I save it, you'll see it disappears over on the right side here. Now we don't have a child component anymore. We have our header, which is still in the parent, but down below the content is gone because I haven't added it. So now I'll add it back in and I'll save that, and you see it comes right back. I am the child is right here, just within our p tags. Now, how do I send data down? What if I want to put a message down here? I'll add some more p tags, and I want to put my message right there between the p tags. Well, if we look at our documentation, we see that on the child component, on the child HTML tag, the element, I use a property, or rather an attribute, and I can name that whatever I want, by the way. The example uses message, but I can name that whatever I want. So I'll go back here and I'll just use message for So we stay in line with the documentation. And in the example, they just use a simple string, hello. So jump back. You'll see we just have a simple string just like that. Now, how do we access that in the child component? At this point, the parent is passing it in, but the child's not set up to actually receive it and do anything with it. Well, we have to tell the child that it should expect some properties. It should expect some props from the parent. And we use the props attribute. Now, we can set this up as an object or an array. And I'll actually use the array at first to better match what we're doing in our example in the documentation. And the message string in that array simply references whatever we named the attribute here. So go back here. Since we also called it message, we'll go up here and we'll set a message. And now anywhere in this component options object, we can reference this with this dot message. So beware, if you have data already set up here, you cannot have a message property up here because the two will clash. So you can't have the same, you can't have it named the same because both of them will be this dot message and you can't do that clearly. So we'll take that out. So just be aware of that. And then within our template, of course, we access it just like any other data property. And we just use our double curly braces and we access message like that. So what do we want our message to be? Right here, it's hello. We're passing it in as a string. And we see right here on the right, we have our hello message. So that's successfully being passed down to the child. Now, like I said, we can name this anything else. We can say message of the day. We can change this. As long as these three match up, it will be just fine. Now, let's see, sorry, there's hello. Now, one thing to be aware of, you may or may not want to make this camel case. You may want to use hyphens between your words. It's totally up to you. I tend to use camel case and it's always worked out fine for me. Now, what if though we don't want to just pass in simple strings? We want to actually dynamically set this attribute. We want to set this property automatically when data changes. So whatever data we're passing in here, that's going to change over time. That's going to change as the user is interacting with the UI. How do we dynamically set that property? And the answer is found under the dynamic props heading. So we'll click on that and we'll see that we use the vbind syntax. And when we use vbind, what we put in here in the quotation marks is no longer going to be interpreted as a string. It will now be interpreted as a property on the parent object. So let me illustrate. I'll take this out and I'll just put hello. And we'll change this back to message just to keep it simple. And if I set this like vbind : message, hello is no longer a string. Hello is actually expected as a this dot hello on the object. So what it's looking for is this right here. It's looking for that. Or it could be looking for computed property. So if it's a computed property, it could be looking for hello like that. Okay, so anything this dot whatever, that's what it's looking for. So we'll take out our computed properties and we'll set hello to hello world. And when I save that, you'll see now, it takes a second, codepen. Did I make a mistake somewhere? Oh, yeah, I have to return this. I have to return an object. My bad. There we go. There, now we have hello world. There's our new message. So I am binding this message prop, this attribute, to this now. So hello is no longer a string. It is now a property on the component. Clear? So if I wanted to really do this, I'd probably call this something like my message. And this has to match, of course, and that will be hello world. vbind message, message wires up to the prop here, which is shown in the template just like that. Okay. Now, short form we can use is just take the vbind out altogether and just use a colon, and that works as well. I tend to use just the colons. It's pretty rare that I'll put a vbind in there. And that's all there is to that. That's pretty simple. Now, let's quickly touch on how to validate props. I don't want to get too in depth with this, but I want to show it to you because I use prop validation in my examples down below. If we go under components again, just a few steps down, we have prop validation. And that's where we set up our props as an object, as properties on an object, rather than strings in an array. So right here we have our message as a string in an array. I'm going to use an object here instead. Message is a property on that object. Message is equal to an object, and I can do a few things to make sure that the props I'm passing in are what I expect. And we use things like type, required. We can even set defaults. This is really handy. I really recommend you get used to this. If you're ready to accept a few different types, rather than just a string, you can use an array to set your types as maybe a string or a number. Okay, so let's just follow a very simple example just like this. We'll go up here and we'll set our message as a type. This will be a string. And is it required? Set false. And I don't need to set a default. Again, I don't want to get in too much depth right here. But, oh, okay, I'll show you. Default, this is my default message. And I'll put required true in this case. So let's just pretend real quick. This is definitely required if we're not passing in a message. So let's say this is blank. Let's see, do we still get hello world? No, we get blank. But what if this is not even defined? That's when the default will be used. Refresh. Oh, sorry. I have to set undefined. Let's try that. There we go, undefined. So now our default message is being used. Okay, I'll stop there. If you want to know more about prop validation and setting up defaults and whatnot, have a look at my other videos on reusing components with Vue Router. I use defaults extensively there, so you can play around with that. Let's see if we can make this a little more complicated now. So we'll just minimize these here. And we'll jump down to our rating and users. Now in this example, rating is the child component. Users is the parent component. And if you jump over to the menu, you go over to the users link. Don't click users 2, that's a different one. Make sure it says users at the top. What will happen in this component, in our parent portion, we have a list of 3 users. And when you click on one of these users, the rating, which is found in the brackets, the rating from that user object will be passed down to a child component, which will be this set of radio buttons here. And notice the rating 3 is set up to be selected automatically in the child component, which is just the radio buttons. If we select the second one, then it's updated again. Select the third one, it's updated again. So that's what's happening there. And then in the child component, I want to be able to change this and have that sent back up to the parent so the parent can reflect the change. So you see it's 5. If I select 4, it's updated here, but it also changes in the parent. Again, I go to the second user. If I change this to a 1, it'll change to a 1 here as well. These are 2 separate pieces of data, but in the child, in the rating, in the radio boxes, I'm sending that back up to the parent so the parent can update as well. Now, in the real world, what we will probably do here is upon selection, send that off to the database, and when the update is successful, then we'll update the parent. I won't do that today. I'll just set up a little dummy example for that. So let's expand these and take a look at what the code actually shows. So again, the rating is the child, and we have our template here, which is just 5 radio buttons. They're wired up to affect the same piece of data with the V model attribute right here. So they're all wired up to user rating. Okay, so whichever one is selected, that's the one that will set the user rating value. And we'll go down to our users, which is our parent. And you'll recognize this right here. User rating is the child component, which is wired up down at the bottom, just like in our example above. And that's set up here. Now, I don't show it until a user is selected. The selected user rating, you know this little colon there, that's the attribute that we're sending down as a prop. So if we've done this correctly, we should see selected user rating set up as a property or on the props object of the child, and we see it right here, selected user rating. And notice I'm using the prop validation syntax here, just like I showed you in above. And what's actually being passed down? Well, what's being passed down is the selected user and then the rating property on that selected user object. And If we go down here, we'll see set selected user. This is how it's all happening. So when I click on one of these users, it's firing set selected user with that user being passed in. We go down to that method, we see this selected user equals user. So every time we select a new one, this property is changing. And as the value is changing, this selected user right here is automatically being sent down to the child. So every time this changes, the data updates automatically down in the child, whatever we're passing down. The child is set up with this props to take that value. And here's where it gets a little bit tricky. The first time this child component is mounted, it's created, it is mounted, so the lifecycle hooks fire. So I use the mounted lifecycle hook to use this selected user rating to initialize user rating. An important thing to note is we don't want to affect selected user rating directly because that will affect it up in the parent and we'll get a warning. So get used to initializing another property in the child using the props that are passed down. So I initialize it right here, but every other time that I click on a new user here, this component will be reused. The mounted lifecycle hook won't be fired anymore. So now I need to set up a custom watcher, which is right down here, selected user rating. I'm watching that value, and as it changes, I'm taking the new value and I'm wiring it up to user rating again. Now, why don't I just use the watcher? Well, because on the first time, the component doesn't exist yet, therefore the watcher won't exist yet. So I can't use just the watcher and I can't use just the mounted lifecycle hook. I have to use both of them. So take note of that. In sum, make sure you're not affecting the props directly. Use it just to initialize another property on your component. So in this case, user rating. I do it both in mounted and in the watcher to make sure that it stays up to date. And I'll show you what I mean. I've selected Leanne here. Leanne is selected there in the child component. When I go over to Irvin, it updates each time I click. But if I were to comment this out, if I were to comment out the code in my watcher, you'll see that it won't update. So go back to users, select the first one, no problem. I have my 3, but when I select Irvin, which is 2, this doesn't change. It stays as a 3. Stays as a 3. It doesn't change. So I do need my watcher there to make sure I reinitialize user rating every time a new user is selected. Again, this is because the component for performance reasons is being reused. So that's why we need the watcher. Now, moving on. As I just said earlier, we have to get used to initializing values using the props that are passed down because we can't affect the props directly. We'll get a warning from Vue. So how do we update parents? If I can't do something with selected user rating directly, then how do I send that data back up to the parent? And the way to do this is using custom events. It's not readily apparent where we find this info unless you're specifically looking for custom events. So here we go. Under components, we have a custom events subheading, and you can read about it here using the vOn and the vEmit. So on and emit methods, this is the way we emit a custom event with a payload, so with some data, and then we listen to it with the on handler, and then we handle that data that's being passed. So the child will emit a new event when data changes, or whenever we want. It will emit the new data, and then the parent will be listening for that event. So rather than using props to pass things down and up, children use events to pass data up. So let's look at how that's working. In our rating component, each vModel is hooked up to user rating, which was initialized with the selected user rating. So every time we select a new user, our user rating, which is wired up to the radio buttons, is being initialized. It's being reset, just like that, because the component is being reused in this case. So then we take our user rating, we change it. So we'll go to the first one, Leanne. We change this to a 5. And what happens? Once that changes, we have a watcher on that value. So the watcher says, hey, something's changed. What do you want me to do? So now that it's changed, this function gets used. We take in our new rating and we look at our old rating, but we only take the new rating. We don't really need this. I just put it there so you would know that that's available. And let's say we do some async function here. We take our new rating, we send it off to the database, and on a successful update, so if success, and I just said success equals true, just to set that up for you, then we use this.emit with the $sign in front of it. We give our custom event a name, so in this case it's rating updated, and we pass along our payload, which is the new rating. Now our parent is ready to receive this. We'll go down here to the parent. And on that same user rating component, we have a VON set up, and that's kind of hard to read, so I'll do it like that. VON, here's our event listener. VON, which type of event? The rating updated event. If I name this anything else and it didn't match this right here, then it wouldn't work. But it's listening for rating updated. So when that is fired, when that event is fired, what do? Well, we invoke the change display rating function. All right, so let's go down to our methods. Do we have just, change displayed rating, and the parameter we receive is the value, the new value that we sent up here. So whatever our payload was, we get that right away here as the first parameter. So now we have our value. So what am I going to do with that? Now that I've passed up an update, the update was successful, I'm passing up the new rating to the parent catches it right here, and we just reference our user list and we find our selected user ID, because we've selected our user. Which user? ID 1 in this case. And we change the rating property to that new value. So we have a 3 here, a 3. I change this to a 4, throws it back up, parent catches it, and it resets it to 4. And that's all there is to it. So quick recap, quick summary. Parents pass data down via props. And those are wired up quite simply by setting up a dynamic property like this, an attribute. We pass in our data right here. Remember, it doesn't expect a string, it expects some dynamic data. So this will reference a this dot selected user, this dot message, whatever. The child is ready to receive it by setting it up on the props object. That's it. Then it can use it, do what it wants. Maybe it just renders that data. In the case of like a functional component, one that doesn't really do anything with the data, it just displays things. That may be all you need. You just need to pass it into the template and that's it. But in this case, we want to affect it in the child and then we want to throw it back up. So once it's affected, we put a watcher on our new initialized property. Remember, we don't affect it directly. We initialize another property with it. We do what we want with it. When that changes, we can do that with a watcher that we send an event back up. Now we can do this with an event, so we're automatically sending it up every time we click, or you can do it with a save button. So you hook up a click handler to a button, you click save, and it'll then take the data and then emit the event. There's a number of ways you can emit the event. You give that event a name. This rating updated event is being listened to with the V on right here, rating updated. What do? How do you handle it? Change displayed rating. The change displayed rating method referenced here automatically catches the payload that was sent right here. And then you can do what you want with it at that point. So hopefully that part is clear. If you have any questions about that part, please post it down below. Play around with it a little bit, and when you're ready, jump to the next part because I'll show you another way to handle this back and forth between parent and child. And that way is with the sync modifier. You can find that here in the documentation just below custom events, sync modifier. Now to really understand this one, it was important to go through the previous step in understanding how we set up the watchers, and when we pass data up to the parent, how we listen for that, and how we make the changes on our parent data. That is basically what's happening with the sync modifier, but the sync modifier makes things a lot shorter. It's a lot less code for you to write, and hopefully that would maybe result in fewer bugs as well. So it's a nice feature. It's different than what it was earlier in Vue's history, and you can read about that here in the documentation. So take a few minutes to read through it, pause the video, play around with it a little bit, and see if you can get your head around that before we go through it together. Okay, did you take a few minutes to go through it? I hope you did, because pausing videos like this, exploring a little bit on your own before going forward is a good idea. It'll help you develop your own questions and you will learn that much more effectively. So let's get started. We're looking this time at rating 2 and users 2 over in our links. Go to the users 2 page. And you'll see if you expand them right here, the users 2 and the ratings 2, it's not that much different than the one above, but you'll notice a little bit less code, which is kind of nice. So jumping into users 2, we see our user rating child component, and we have our selected user rating right there. So that is the prop that is going to be watched on the child. So selected user rating is up here in the child again under props. Right there, it's still a number. I'll go down. What's being passed into that? Selected user rating, again, just like before. This time we have the sync modifier added to the end of our selected user rating. And notice in this case, we don't have a v on listener. So up here, we had in our first users, we had our v on, and then we were calling the change displayed rating once the rating updated event was fired. So we'll go down here. We're passing down the rating. The child, so the child template having all of the radio buttons here. We still take that in. We initiate, or rather we initialize user rating on the mounted lifecycle hook. We continue to watch it and we update it every time it changes, just like before. This time when we have our user rating set and we're watching the changes to the rating, so that is when we select a new radio button, we're emitting another event, but it's different. We're emitting the update : selected user rating. So this selected user rating must match selected user rating here on our props, which is matching selected user rating down here. So we're updating that. We're updating selected user rating. And that will signal to the parent object, the parent component, to then take whatever is being passed up and set selected user rating equal to that value. So instead of listening to that event ourselves and down here somewhere doing this dot selected user dot rating equals and then the new rating like we did in our first example just above, that all happens under the hood. You can see this in the documentation. We have foo, and this foo corresponds to our selected user rating. And the bar right here, this is our rating that we're passing down. And you can see that this just expands to an updated function being executed inline, where the new value coming in to the update is just being set as the new value for bar. So the new value coming in is just being set to equal the rating right here. That's all it is. So whereas before we had to listen for that and wire it up ourselves, it happens all under the hood on its own. Now, quick note. The sync modifier used to do direct changes to the parent's data. And it notes right here that we're not really doing that anymore. They frown upon that that practice. It's not a good thing to do, as it confuses things. It makes it hard to debug things and whatnot. So the sync modifier has been brought back, but it's been changed to what we just looked at. So the sync modifier is now this. It's no longer affecting data directly on the parent. So it's just short form for what we did up above in our user and our rating. So that's all there is to that. Play around with it. If you have any questions, please put them down below the video. It's really worth getting to know this deeply, really getting it into your head, and so that it becomes more intuitive to you, so you really get how things are wired up together. That'll help you in time for the next video, where we'll cover how to communicate data between two sibling components. And that would be the case, perhaps we had a rating component and another component right next to it, all under the parent of users. And we'll do that in the next video. So again, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any of the updates. Put any questions down below. A thumbs up is also appreciated. We'll see you next time.